Listen closely because what I'm about to say may shake something awake inside you. There comes a moment when silence becomes louder than arguments, stronger than pleading, and more powerful than love letters ever were. Not because you disappeared, but because you finally stood still. And in that stillness, something shifted. What they couldn't control anymore began to confront them, and that confrontation, it changed everything. Your silence did what explanations never could. It stepped back and allowed truth to step forward. You see, when someone avoids connection, avoids responsibility, avoids emotional depth, they are not powerful, they are hiding. And when you stop chasing what hides, the hiding place collapses. That's when embarrassment shows up. Not because you said something wrong, but because you said nothing at all. There is a divine intelligence in restraint. Wisdom knows when words are wasted. Purpose knows when energy must be reclaimed. You were never meant to beg someone to see your worth. The moment you withdrew your voice, you withdrew your permission for confusion, for mixed signals, for half-hearted presence. And suddenly, they were left alone with the echo of their own behavior. Anger often follows embarrassment, not righteous anger but wounded pride, because your silence removed their leverage. They can no longer provoke a reaction. They can no longer rewrite the story. They can no longer convince themselves that you were the problem. And that is deeply uncomfortable for someone who survives by avoiding truth. Understand this clearly. Silence is not weakness. It is alignment. It is the soul saying, I trust what is unfolding without forcing it. When you stopped explaining, you stepped into dignity. When you stopped reacting, you stepped into authority. And when you stopped chasing, you stepped into divine order. There is a sacred law at work here. What is meant to grow closer will rise to meet clarity. What is not meant to stay will reveal itself back through resistance. Your quiet did not push them away, it simply stopped protecting them from themselves. And that is why it worked. You didn't abandon them. You chose yourself. You chose peace over performance. You chose truth over tension. And in doing so, you became unrecognizable not because you hardened, but because you healed. Let this settle in your spirit. The right people do not fear your silence. They respect it. The wrong ones are exposed by it. And if someone becomes embarrassed and angry when you stop speaking, it's because your calm uncovered what noise was hiding. Stay grounded. Stay still. Stay wise. What you didn't say spoke volumes and the universe heard every word. Silence removes emotional supply and exposes inner insecurity in a way that words never can. When someone is accustomed to distance, avoidance, and emotional control, they often rely consciously or unconsciously on reactions from others to stabilize their inner world. Attention, explanations, reassurance, affect confrontation. Even conflict becomes sources of emotional fuel. They confirm relevance. They maintain a sense of power. Silence interrupts that supply completely. And when the supply stops, what remains is the raw, unfiltered self. Silence is unsettling because it offers no feedback loop. There is nothing to push against, nothing to correct, nothing to reinterpret. For someone who avoids emotional depth, this is terrifying. Avoidance is not confidence, it is self-protection built on fear. Fear of being seen, fear of being exposed, fear of being responsible for emotional impact. When silence enters the space, it removes the distraction. There is no longer another person absorbing tension, softening discomfort, or carrying emotional labor on their behalf. Without emotional supply, the mind turns inward. That is where insecurity lives. That is where unresolved shame, self-doubt, and unmet emotional needs surface. Silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors are honest. They reflect patterns, not affect intentions. They show behavior without excuses. This is why silence often triggers discomfort first, then agitation. It forces an internal audit to avoid the one that never wanted to conduct. Words can be debated. Silence cannot. Arguments can be reframed. Silence cannot. Explanations allow deflection. Silence removes escape routes. It quietly communicates, I will no longer participate in confusion. And that message destabilizes anyone who relies on ambiguity to feel safe. Emotional supply keeps insecurity dormant. Silence wakes it up. Insecurity thrives on external validation. When validation disappears, the nervous system reacts. The body interprets silence as loss of control. Not loss of love - loss of control. Control over narrative. Control over timing. Control over emotional outcomes. This is why silence feels threatening. It signals autonomy. It signals boundaries without negotiation. It says, you no longer get to define this dynamic alone. The most revealing aspect of silence is that it does nothing actively, yet it creates movement internally. It doesn't accuse, but it confronts. It doesn't demand accountability, but it invites it. The insecurity that surfaces is not caused by silence, it was always there. Silence simply removes the noise that kept it hidden. There is also a spiritual dimension to this. Silence is alignment with truth rather than persuasion. It trusts that what is real does not need to be defended endlessly. When you become silent, you stop managing another person's emotions. You stop cushioning their discomfort. You stop translating your worth into language they may never understand. That withdrawal of effort exposes the imbalance that existed all along. Insecurity resists stillness because stillness reveals dependency. Silence reveals who needed whom more. It shows where power was borrowed rather than earned. And once that exposure happens, it cannot be undone. The dynamic has shifted not through force, but through clarity. Silence removes emoti, onal supply not as a tactic, but as a natural consequence of self-respect. And insecurity, when left alone with itself, has no choice but to surface. Avoidant behavior often masks fear of intimacy and accountability, not because connection is unwanted, but because it feels unsafe. At the surface, avoidance looks like independence, emotional restraint, or a need for space. Beneath it, however, is a nervous system conditioned to associate closeness with risk. Intimacy requires presence. Presence invites vulnerability. Vulnerability demands honesty. And honesty brings responsibility for how one's actions affect another. For the avoidant, this chain feels overwhelming. Fear of intimacy does not mean fear of people, it means fear of being fully known. Being seen removes the ability to hide behind charm, distance, or ambiguity. It exposes inconsistencies between words and actions. It requires emotional follow-through. Avoidant patterns emerge as a way to maintain connection without surrender. Ring control. There is closeness, but only to a limit. Care, but not commitment. Interest, but not responsibility. This controlled engagement allows the avoidant to receive benefits without facing the weight of accountability. Accountability is particularly threatening because it demands self-examination. It asks questions the avoidant would rather postpone. Why do I pull away when things deepen? Why do I feel suffocated by consistency? Why do I disappear instead of communicate? These questions destabilize the self-image of being easygoing or low maintenance. Avoidance protects identity. It preserves the belief that distance is a preference rather than a defense mechanism. Intimacy also challenges emotional self-sufficiency myths. Many avoidants learned early that relying on others leads to disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. As a result, independence becomes a shield rather than a strength. Emotional needs are minimized, dismissed, or intellectualized. When intimacy invaded, its mutual dependence, it threatens the internal rule that safety comes from self-containment. Accountability then feels like exposure, not growth. Avoidance allows emotions to be managed indirectly. Instead of addressing discomfort, the avoidant withdraws. Instead of explaining boundaries, they create distance. Instead of acknowledging harm, they minimize impact. These strategies reduce immediate anxiety but create long-term disconnection. The irony is that avoidance does not eliminate responsibility, it delays it. Unspoken issues accumulate. Unacknowledged emotions linger. And when they surface, they do so with greater intensity. Fear of accountability also includes fear of being wrong. Being accountable means admitting mistakes, recognizing emotional blind spots, and accepting that intentions do not erase consequences. For the avoidant, this can feel like a threat to autonomy. It feels like being trapped in expectations they never agreed to articulate. So they retreat, hoping NCE will dissolve responsibility. But distance does not erase impact, it only obscures it temporarily. Avoidant behavior is often misunderstood as emotional coldness, but it is more accurately emotional overload. The system is overwhelmed by relational demands it never learned to navigate safely. Rather than negotiate needs openly, avoidance becomes the default. This pattern persists until something interrupts it, usually loss, silence, or the withdrawal of emotional pursuit from the other person. When intimacy is no longer pursued and accountability is no longer deferred, the avoidant is left with the reality they were trying to outrun. not because someone forced them to change, but because the protective strategy stopped working. Avoidance loses its power when it no longer controls the relational outcome. And in that moment, fear becomes visible not as strength, but as the unhealed core beneath the distance. Your restraint becomes a mirror they cannot escape, because restraint remove. Effect S distortion. When you are constantly explaining yourself, reacting, or trying to be understood, you are not only expressing your truth, you are also shaping how the other person avoids their own. Every reaction you give becomes a distraction from their self-reflection. Every explanation becomes a bridge they can walk across instead of standing still and looking inward. But when you stop, that bridge disappears. And what remains is reflection without interference. A mirror does not argue, it simply reflects. In the same way, your restraint does not attack, accuse, or chase. It simply exists in its own clarity. And clarity is uncomfortable for anyone who has been relying on confusion to stay emotionally unaccountable. When you are emotionally engaged in constant response, the dynamic stays active. There is movement, tension, and back and forth energy that keeps both people focused on interaction rather than introspection. But restraint shifts the focus. It turns the attention away from managing you and back toward confronting themselves. This is where discomfort begins to rise. Not because you have done harm, but because you have stopped participating in the pattern that allowed avoidance to continue unnoticed. When someone is used to your emotional availability, your silence feels like absence of control. They can no longer predict your reactions. They can no longer rely on your explanations to soften the impact of their behavior. They are left with your absence, and your absence begins to speak. What it speaks is not noise, but truth. It says, I am no longer available for confusion. It says, I will not overextend to make disconnection feel comfortable. And without you actively filling the space, the person is forced to sit with what they previously avoided, their own contribution to the dynamic. This is why restraint is so powerful. It does not add pressure, it removes escape. A mirror cannot be negotiated with. You cannot convince it to show a more favorable reference. Lection. You cannot argue it into changing what is already there. In the same way, your restraint does not bend to emotional pressure or reinterpret itself to maintain comfort. It simply holds position, and holding position is often more confronting than any confrontation itself. When someone avoids emotional accountability, they often rely on relational noise to stay externally focused. Conflict, confusion, mixed signals, or even emotional pursuit from the other person keeps their attention outward. It allows them to stay engaged without going inward. But restraint ends that external stimulation. It removes the emotional engagement that once kept them from self-examination. In that absence, reflection becomes unavoidable. They begin to notice patterns they previously dismissed. The timing of their withdrawal, the inconsistency in their communication, the moments they chose distance over honesty. These realizations are not created by your silence, they were always there. Your restraint effect simply stops covering them. What makes this mirror impossible to escape is that it is not emotional manipulation, it is emotional neutrality. There is no anger to push against, no pleading to dismiss, no argument to win. There is only stillness, and stillness forces awareness. It does not demand change, but it removes the illusion that nothing needs to change. Over time, this reflection becomes heavier than interaction ever was. Because interaction allowed deflection, but restraint allows truth, and truth, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. Embarrassment arises when control no longer works, because control is often the hidden foundation beneath emotional avoidance. When someone relies on distance, ambiguity, or emotional withdrawal to manage discomfort, they are not just avoiding vulnerability, they are maintaining a sense of power over how the relationship unfolds. Control, in this sense, is not always loud or obvious. It can look like delayed responses, selective engagement, or affectional unpredictability. These patterns create an illusion of authority over connection, but when that influence stops producing results, embarrassment begins to surface. Embarrassment is not simply about being caught in the traditional sense. It is about being seen without the tools that once shaped perception. When control works, perception feels flexible. The narrative can be adjusted. The emotional temperature can be changed by reappearing, withdrawing, or offering partial engagement. But when the other person no longer reacts, no longer chases, and no longer participates in the cycle, that flexibility disappears. Suddenly, there is no longer a way to manage how they are being perceived through behavior alone. This shift is deeply unsettling for someone who has depended on emotional distance as a form of regulation. Control allows avoidance to feel functional. It gives structure to inconsistency. It makes emotional disconnection feel intentional rather than reactive. But silence, effect from the other side, removes that structure. It removes the feedback that once confirmed influence. And without feedback, the illusion of control collapses. Embarrassment often emerges in the space between expectation and reality. The expectation is that withdrawal will create pursuit. That silence will create confusion. That distance will eventually pull the other person back into engagement. But when the reality does not follow that script, the emotional system experiences disruption. That disruption is felt as exposure, not because something new has been revealed, but because something familiar no longer responds the way it used to. This is where the internal shift happens. The avoidant or controlling pattern begins to lose its predictability. What once guaranteed attention now produces stillness. What once created emotional reaction now creates absence. And absence, when unexpected, feels like a spotlight. It reveals the limits of influence. It reveals that emotional outcomes cannot, in fact, always be directed or engineered. Embarrassment is closely tied to identity. If someone has built a sense of relational power around being unreachable, unbothered, or in control, then losing that dynamic feels like losing part of the self-image. It is not just about the situation, it is about how they are now being reflected in it. When your silence no longer responds to their patterns, it quietly communicates that their usual strategies are no longer effective. And effectiveness is often what upheld their emotional confidence. There is also a subtle realization that follows. The absence of reaction does not mean absence of awareness. You are no longer responding, but you are also no longer participating in distortion. That creates a different kind of visibility, one that cannot be shaped or redirected. And that is where embarrassment deepens, when they realize they are still being seen, but no longer being engaged in the way that allowed them to manage the story. At its core, in fact, his embarrassment is the nervous system recognizing a loss of control over relational outcome. It is the moment when emotional tactics stop producing predictable results. And in that moment, what surfaces is not just discomfort, but the realization that influence was never as stable as it seemed. Anger surfaces when manipulation fails, because anger is often the emotional backup when influence is lost. When subtle control no longer works, when silence is met with silence, distance is met with detachment, and emotional unpredictability no longer produces a reaction, the internal system looks for another way to regain equilibrium. Anger becomes that substitute. It is faster, louder, and more forceful than vulnerability. And for someone who has relied on indirect emotional strategies, it feels like the only remaining tool that can still shift the dynamic. Manipulation does not always appear as something intentional or malicious. In many cases, it is subtle. Withdrawing affection to create you, affect uncertainty, delaying communication to provoke pursuit, or offering inconsistent attention to maintain emotional leverage. These behaviors often function to regulate internal discomfort rather than to harm the other person. But when the other person no longer participates in the cycle, those strategies stop producing results. And when emotional strategies stop working, frustration builds beneath the surface. That frustration does not immediately present itself as vulnerability. Vulnerability would require acknowledgement of need, fear, or emotional dependence. Instead, the mind protects itself by converting that discomfort into anger. Anger feels stronger. It feels justified. It shifts the focus outward rather than inward. Instead of asking, "Why am I feeling powerless?" it becomes, "Why are they acting this way?" This shift protects the ego from self-examination. When your silence enters the dynamic, it removes the emotional feedback loop that manipulation depends on. There is no reacti, effect on to provoke, no response to shape, and no emotional signal to decode. This absence is destabilizing because manipulation relies on predictability of response. Even negative reactions confirm influence, but silence denies that confirmation entirely. It refuses to validate the strategy, and when strategies stop working, emotional escalation often follows. Anger also arises from perceived loss of control over narrative. In many avoidant or manipulative dynamics, there is an unspoken expectation that emotional distance will eventually lead the other person to re-engage, to explain, or to chase clarity. When that expectation is broken, it can feel like rejection of authority. Not just emotional authority, but relational authority, the belief that one can determine the rhythm of connection. Your silence interrupts that rhythm completely. What makes this anger more complex is that it is often layered with confusion. The person may not fully understand why they are reacting so strongly. On this surface, it may appear as irritation toward your detachment, but underneath it is a reaction to power shifting. When you stop feeding the cycle, you are no longer reinforcing the dynamic that allowed emotional control to exist, and losing that reinforcement feels like losing stability. There is also an internal conflict that fuels the anger further. Part of the person may recognize that your silence is not aggression, but self-respect. Another part resists that recognition because it forces accountability. Accepting your silence as boundary means acknowledging their role in creating the distance. And for someone unaccustomed to that level of responsibility, this creates inner tension. Anger becomes the release valve for that tension. In many cases, anger is not truly about you. It is about the loss of access to your reactions, your emotional availability, and your responsiveness. It is the discomfort of no longer being able to influence outcomes through familiar patterns. When those patterns collapse, emotional regulation becomes difficult and anger rushes in to fill the gap. But even in its intensity, this anger reveals something important. The strategy of control has reached its limit. When silence no longer responds, manipulation loses its foundation. And what follows is not power regained, but power exposed as something that was never stable to begin with. Silence is not punishment, it is self-respect in action. That distinction is essential because silence can be misunderstood when viewed through the lens of reaction rather than intention. Punishment seeks to control outcomes, to make someone feel a consequence in order to influence their behavior. It is rooted in emotional reactivity and often carries an undercurrent of attachment to the other person's response. Self-respect, however, is not about controlling another person's understanding. It is about aligning with one's own emotional truth and no longer participating in dynamics that compromise inner peace. When silence is rooted in self-respect, it is not loud, reactive, or emotionally charged. It is deliberate. It emerges after clarity, not confusion. It is the moment when you recognize that continuing to explain yourself to someone who consistently misunderstands you is not communication, it is depletion. It is the realization that your voice has been used more for survival in the relationship than for genuine connection. And at that point, silence becomes restoration rather than withdrawal. Self-respect begins where over-explaining ends. There is a point where words stop creating understanding and start creating exhaustion. You repeat yourself, reframe your intentions, soften your tone, and still find yourself in the same emotional cycle. Silence interrupts that cycle not to create distance for impact, but to create space for integrity. It is the refusal to keep translating your truth into a language that is repeatedly ignored or distorted. Punishment says, "I will stop speaking." So you feel what you did. Self-respect says, "I will stop speaking because I no longer need to prove what I already know." The difference lies in attachment. Punishment is still emotionally tethered to the other person's reaction. Self-respect is anchored internally. It does not depend on whether the other person understands, agrees, or responds. It simply holds its boundary without explanation. Silence as self-respect also restores emotional balance. When you are constantly engaged in explaining, justifying, or pursuing clarity, you are giving away emotional energy in hopes of resolution. But resolution cannot be forced through repetition. At some point, continued engagement becomes self-abandonment. Silence reclaims that energy. It brings attention back to your internal state rather than external validation. There is a quiet strength in no longer participating in confusion. Confusion often thrives in communication loops where one person is over-invested in being understood and the other. In fact, there is under-invested in understanding. Silence breaks that imbalance. It removes the emotional labor from your side of the equation and places responsibility back where it belongs. Not as punishment, but as truth. Self-respect does not require emotional justification. It does not need to be validated by the other person in order to be real. This is why silence can feel so powerful. It is final in a way words are not. Words invite debate. Silence invites reflection. But more importantly, silence protects dignity. It prevents you from continuing to explain your worth to someone who has repeatedly demonstrated that they are not listening with care. There is also a deeper emotional healing that happens in silence. When you stop reacting, you begin to observe. When you stop explaining, you begin to understand your own patterns more clearly. You see where you overextended. You recognize where you ignored discomfort. You notice where you compromised clarity for connection. Silence becomes a effect space of internal recalibration, not external strategy. In this sense, silence is not about the other person at all. It is about returning to yourself. It is about refusing to abandon your emotional truth for the sake of keeping a dynamic alive that no longer honors it. It is the quiet decision to stop negotiating your peace. Divine order restores dignity when you stop chasing because it realigns you with a truth that pursuit often distorts. When you are chasing, whether it is attention, clarity, consistency, or emotional reciprocity, you are operating from a place of imbalance. Not because your desire is wrong, but because your energy is being directed outward in a way that begins to erode your inner foundation. You start to measure your worth by response instead of truth, by availability instead of alignment. Divine order interrupts that drift and brings you back to center. There is a natural law in emotional dynamics. What is aligned does not require force. What is meant for you does, in fact, not require depletion. When you find yourself constantly pursuing, explaining, or trying to secure clarity from someone who repeatedly withholds it, you are not in flow, you are in resistance. And resistance, over time, creates exhaustion. Divine order does not punish that exhaustion, it corrects it. It steps in quietly and begins to remove what cannot meet you at your level of emotional integrity. When you stop chasing, something profound happens that is often misunderstood. It is not that love disappears or connection vanishes, it is that distortion loses momentum. Chasing often keeps unclear dynamics alive. It sustains ambiguity. It allows inconsistency to feel like potential. But when you withdraw pursuit, that illusion begins to dissolve. What remains is reality without interference. And reality, though sometimes uncomfortable, is always clarifying. Dignity returns in that clarity. Because dignity is not maintained through effort, it is maintained through alignment. Every time you chase what is inconsistent, you subtly communicate to yourself that your peace is negotiable. Divine order reverses that message. It restores the understanding that your emotional stability is not something to be bargained for. It is something to be protected. There is also a spiritual recalibration that happens when pursuit ends. Energy that was once scattered toward managing outcomes begins to return inward. You start to notice your own emotional rhythm again. You begin to feel where you were overextending, where you were compensating, where you were tolerating uncertainty in the name of connection. This awareness is not punishment, it is restoration. It is the nervous system finally exiting survival mode and entering clarity. Divine order often feels like distance at first, but it is actually realignment. What was once emotionally tangled begins to separate. Not through force, but through truth becoming undeniable. People who were only accessible through your pursuit begin to reveal their actual level of presence. And that revelation, while sometimes painful, is deeply dignifying because it removes illusion. You no longer have to guess where you stand, you begin to see it clearly. Chasing creates a subtle erosion of self-respect because it places your emotional authority outside of yourself. You start waiting for signals, interpreting inconsistency, and adapting your behavior to maintain connection. Divine order restores that authority. It brings you back to the understanding that your presence does not need to be negotiated. Your attention is not a reward for confusion. Your care is not a response to uncertainty. In this restored state, dignity is not something you perform, it is something you embody. You stop reaching for what continually retreats. You stop explaining yourself to those who are not listening with intention. And in that stopping, something stabilizes within you. The emotional noise quiets. The urgency fades. The internal tension that came from trying to hold together something inconsistent begins to dissolve. Divine order does not remove connection, it removes distortion. It does not strip love, it strips imbalance. And in that process, what remains is clarity, and clarity is always dignifying. Growth begins when you choose peace over explanation, because explanation often keeps you locked in cycles that demand more of your energy than they return in understanding. When you are constantly explaining yourself, you are participating in a dynamic where your inner truth is repeatedly put on trial. You present your intentions, your emotions, your perspective, hoping that clarity will lead to connection. But in many cases, explanation does not create understanding, it creates exhaustion. And exhaustion is not growth. Peace, however, requires a different kind of courage. It requires the willingness to step away from being understood by everyone and instead remain aligned with yourself. Choosing peace means recognizing that not every misunderstanding deserves a response. Not every emotional disconnect requires your intervention. Not every silence from another person needs to be filled with your voice. Explanation often comes from a desire to repair, to fix, to bridge gaps that are not always yours to close. But growth happens when you realize that some gaps exist not because you failed to communicate, but because the other person is not meeting you with the same level of presence or willingness to understand. There is a point where continuing to explain becomes a form of self-abandonment. You begin to override your own emotional signals in order to keep the connection intact. You soften truths that feel sharp. You repeat yourself in different ways, hoping the message will land differently. You adjust your tone, your timing, your wording, trying to make your reality more digestible for someone else. Over time, this creates internal fragmentation. You are no longer fully expressed, you are partially edited for acceptance. In fact, peace interrupts that fragmentation. It asks you to stop performing emotional translation for people who are not invested in comprehension. It asks you to trust that clarity does not always require repetition. Sometimes clarity is already present but not being honored. And when that is the case, more explanation does not solve the problem, it only deepens your involvement in something that is already misaligned. Growth emerges in the moment you stop overfunctioning in communication and start observing reality as it is, not as you hope it could be. Explanation often keeps hope artificially alive. It suggests that if you just say it one more time, in a better way, with more patience, the outcome will change. But peace recognizes when effort is no longer the missing piece. Awareness is. Choosing peace also shifts your relationship with validation. When you are caught in explanation loops, you often seek confirmation that your perspective is valid, your feelings are reasonable, and your intentions are understood. But peace no longer depends on external confirmation. It begins to anchor within your own recognition of truth. You stop outsourcing emotional certainty to people who are inconsistent with it. There is also a deep nervous system shift that occurs when explanation ends. The body moves out of hypervigilance. The mental scanning for the right words or perfect timing begins to dissolve. Emotional energy that was once spent on anticipation and adjustment returns to stillness. And in that stillness, you begin to reconnect with yourself outside of relational tension. Peace does not mean indifference. It means clarity without compulsion. It is the ability to see something clearly and not feel obligated to overextend yourself to change it. Growth, in this sense, is not about becoming louder or more convincing. It is about becoming quieter internally, more grounded in your perception, and less dependent on external agreement. When you choose peace over explanation, in fact, you are not withdrawing from life, you are withdrawing from distortion. And in that withdrawal, your energy becomes available again for alignment, for healing, and for a version of connection that does not require you to diminish your truth in order to maintain it. And in the end, what you once tried to explain becomes something you no longer need to prove. Because clarity was never meant to be forced, it was meant to be embodied. When you choose silence over chasing, peace over explanation, and self-respect over emotional confusion, you don't lose connection, you reclaim yourself. Let everything that was misaligned reveal its own truth without your interference, and trust that what is meant for you will meet you in honesty, not in pursuit. Thank you for being here, and if this message spoke to your spirit, carry it forward with calm strength. Goodbye, and stay grounded in your peace.